Okay. So as I was saying, so welcome again, everybody, and just saying that the issue of family estrangement, right? Not only on account of abuse and other sort of behavior that we might put into the category of crimes, right? But also because of just identity, right? The idea that a parent was not willing to accept someone for who they are, which led to a rift, which is very hard. It's very difficult on people. And let's see, I'm trying to figure out where that background noise is coming from. So I apologize. But we'll just do our best. Okay. But it often has to do with identity, right? And with the sense that the kid is not fulfilling the parents' idea of who they should be. I'm going to mute everybody, guys, and feel free to unmute yourself when you would like to say something. And if you're waving your hand at me and trying to get my attention and I'm not responding, it's probably because I don't have you on my screen. So just feel free to unmute and to interrupt me. I will not be upset. But this, I think, is a good example of how this process might, one way in which this process may play out. So my mother and her 17 brothers and sisters, wow, can you imagine? Family of 18 kids, had an Orthodox upbringing. All photographs of their father show him wearing a yarmulke. And I was told that he woke up if it fell off during the night. My father, too, came from an Orthodox background. Both my parents were very conscious of the fourth commandment: remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And the Sabbath, Shabbos, as we called it in our Litvak way, was entirely different than the rest of the week. No work was allowed, no driving, no use of the telephone. It was forbidden to switch on a light or a stove. Being physicians, my parents made exceptions. They could not take the phone off the hook or completely avoid driving, but they had to be available if necessary to see patients or operate or deliver babies. So this is obvious for those of you who are Jewish, right? This is kind of a reflexive statement, right? The notion of pikuach hanefesh, right? The idea that that saving a life overrules Shabbat, right? So if someone is calling the doctor on a Sabbath, I think by and large, at least in those days, the presumption was that they were being called for a medical emergency. With robocalls, I'm not so sure you can be so sure about that. These days, and cell phones and so on and so forth, is a more complicated situation. But these are things that cannot wait, and so. So let's move on here. Okay, we lived in a fairly Orthodox Jewish community in Cricklewood, in northwest London. The butcher, the baker, the grocer, the greengrocer, the fishmonger all closed their shops in good time for the Shabbos and did not open their shutters till Sunday morning. All of them and all our neighbors, we imagined, were celebrating Shabbos in much the same fashion as we did. There is this sort of idea in Orthodox Jewish communities, right, that you want to sort of live in an environment where everyone is observing Shabbat within reason, within the same kind of strictures. Around midday on Friday, my mother doffed her surgical identity and attire and devoted herself to making gefilte fish and other delicacies for Shabbos. Just before evening fell, she would light the ritual candles, cupping their flames with her hands and murmuring a prayer. We would all put on clean, fresh Shabbos clothes and gather for the first meal of the Sabbath, the evening meal. My father would lift up his silver wine cup and chant the blessings and the Kiddush. And after the meal, he would lead us all in chanting the grace. So again, in case you're not familiar with the Jewish ritual, right, there are a series of blessings before before the meal, which culminates with the Kiddush, right, which is a sanctification of the day. And then after the meal, there's a fairly elaborate set of prayers that is called the grace after meals, where Jews give thanks for the meal. And it's a sort of it can be sort of the culmination of the evening's table singing. Right? Very often, many families will have songs that they sing during the Sabbath meal, and then they will finish up with that grace after meals. On Saturday mornings, my three brothers and I trailed our parents to Cricklewood Synagogue on Walm Lane, a huge shul built in the 1930s to accommodate part of the exodus of Jews from the East End to Cricklewood at that time. The shul was always full during my boyhood, and we all had our assigned seats, the men downstairs, the women, my mother, various aunts and cousins, upstairs. As a little boy, I sometimes waved to them during the service. Though I could not understand the Hebrew in the prayer book, I loved its sound, and especially hearing the old medieval prayers sung, led by our wonderfully musical chazan, so by the cantor. Right. So, it's worth, if just for anthropological reasons, if you've never been to an Orthodox Jewish service, it's worth going just to sort of see the range of people who show up. And the different ways that people pray. All of us met and mingled outside the synagogue after the service, and we would usually walk to the house of my Aunt Florrie and her Auntie Florrie and her three children to say a Kiddush, right, another sanctification prayer, accompanied by sweet red wine and honey cakes, just enough to stimulate our appetites for lunch. After a cold lunch at home, gefilte fish, poached salmon, beetroot jelly, Saturday afternoons, if not interrupted by emergency medical calls from my parents, would be devoted to family visits. Uncles and aunts and cousins would visit us for tea, or we them. We all lived within walking distance of one another. I just can't imagine having 17 aunts and uncles. That would just be amazing. I guess you would never lack for a place to go on Shabbos afternoon. The Second World War decimated our Jewish community in Cricklewood, and the Jewish community in England as a whole was to lose thousands of people in the post-war years. Many Jews, including cousins of mine, immigrated to Israel. Others went to Australia, Canada, or the States. My eldest brother, Marcus, went to Australia in 1950. Many of those who stayed assimilated and adopted diluted, attenuated forms of Judaism. Our synagogue, which would be packed to capacity when I was a child, grew emptier by the year. I chanted my bar mitzvah portion in 1946 to a relatively full synagogue, including several dozen of my relatives. But this, for me, was the end of formal Jewish practice. I did not embrace the ritual duties of a Jewish adult, praying every day, putting on tefillin before prayer each weekday morning, and I gradually became more indifferent to the beliefs and habits of my parents, though there was no particular point of rupture until I was 18. It was then that my father, inquiring into my sexual feelings, compelled me to admit that I liked boys. I haven't done anything, I said. It's just a feeling. But don't tell Ma. She won't be able to take it. Well, he did tell her, and the next morning she came in with a look of horror on her face and shrieked at me, "You are an abomination. I wish you had never been born." She was no doubt thinking of the verse in Leviticus that read, "If a man also lie with mankind as he lieth with a woman, both of them shall have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them." The matter was never mentioned again, but her harsh words made me hate religion's capacity for bigotry and cruelty. After I qualified as a doctor in 1960, I removed myself abruptly from England and what family and community I had there and went to the new world where I knew nobody. When I moved to Los Angeles, I found a sort of community among the weightlifters on Muscle Beach. And with my fellow neurology residents at UCLA, I craved some deeper connection, meaning in my life. And it was the absence of this, I think, that drew me into near suicidal addiction to amphetamines in the 1960s. So I want to stop on that, right? Just for a moment, because I don't think it takes being called an abomination by your mother to hate religion's capacity for bigotry and cruelty. I think anyone with a conscience, right, would hate the way that pretty much all religions can be used to foment bigotry and cruelty, right? We can always say that this group is more important than that group. Go ahead, Naomi.
Unmute. I'm just fascinated because that tends to be the Yom Kippur portion. And I'm fascinated by the way rabbis of various persuasions attempt to deal with it.
Yeah.
Not terribly successfully, but at least, including the Orthodox, they are starting to try to deal with this.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's along for the ride in the Yom Kippur portion, right? It's not. I don't think that that's the reason that it's there. I think that and I think that the biggest issue with that verse, which is a very, as you say, Naomi, is a very difficult verse to deal with, right? There are certain ideas that we find in the Torah, certain ideas we find in the prophets, certain ideas we find in the Talmud, right, that just go so deeply against what we would now hold, right? But it's also important to remember that they also sort of go against very often what else there is in the Torah and what else there is in the Talmud, right? That we can find countertext. Barbara, I see that Barbara Baird, I saw that you've unmuted yourself. Would you like to say something?
Yes. What I found interesting was how he did not blame his mother at all for saying a thing like that to him, but went right to blaming religion, which I think is very mature of him to do that. I think if my mother had said that to me, I would be horribly upset because she was the one who said it.
Right. And I think that, as Naomi said, one of the reasons, right, that rabbis, including rabbis in Orthodox synagogues, right, are trying to work with this verse, right, which is what rabbis do, right? This is, we should not forget, right, that much of the work of the Talmud, right, is to figure out how to attenuate what we find in the Torah, right, such that we can live in the families and in the societies in which we find ourselves, right? So families that have accepted gay people as people and as full members of our families and of our societies, right, can no longer just accept that verse at what purports to be its face value, right? But the thing to remember is that verse happens in a context, and that verse, the context of that verse, right, is about sexual violence in general, right? And so, one of the more effective ways that I've seen this verse dealt with, right, is that yes, any essentially, if there's sexual violence, man on man sexual violence is no more appropriate than man on woman sexual violence. So we're not talking about loving, committed relationships here, right? Not to mention that, homosexuality is not something that's known in the Bible, right? Our idea of homosexuality is something that, pops up in the 19th century, right? I think sexual activity between men, of course, is something that's probably happened ever since there were people, right? And between women also, right? It's just part of human sexuality. But the concept that we would have of homosexuals as relationships that would be similar to marriage, right? That's very new. Go ahead, Ellen. You have to unmute yourself though.
There were two civilizations that were known. I just don't know enough about sequence of it, but both Greece, ancient Greece, and certainly the oh gosh, the words fail me. The Romans, Romans all incorporated.
Oh, you muted yourself again, Ellen, by mistake.
They within their cultures were cultures that would honor the male, even if it's not called a marriage, but
right. The relationship, right?
Yes, and there has been a tension about Greece and about both civilizations in relation to Judaism.
Yep.
I mean,
absolutely, and and so, I mean, as another teacher of mine says that you don't really see very much in the Talmud about same-sex men having sex together. It's just not something that comes up that often, which means that which suggests, right, that it really wasn't a major category of prohibition. It was in the Torah, right, but the rabbis didn't spend a lot of time talking about it. And I do think that but you can see how it has this effect, right? But remember, in the time that he's talking about, remember his parents may be Orthodox Jews, but they are also Orthodox physicians, not Orthodox in the sense of Jewish, right? But Orthodox in the sense of the medical science of their time, right? Which considered homosexuality not to be a legitimate and common expression of human sexuality. It was considered at that time to be a mental disorder, right? Yes, and the fact that she uses the religious language, or at least in his memory, uses the religious language rather than the scientific language, is interesting. Go ahead, Naomi. You have to unmute though.
Oh, it's sort of, would you rather have your son be crazy or would you ever have him be a sinner?
Right. Exactly. And for someone who is Orthodox in both senses, right, that feels like an impossible choice, right? So who knows?
I'd like to say something as a feminist.
Great.
The position of women in Judaism is abhorrent. Still.
Yep. And I mean, I think right. I think that I think what Sandy, you're absolutely right that that this is sort of a Judaism as a patriarchal religion, right? Puts everyone into certain very confining boxes, right? And I think that what as Naomi says, right? I mean, one of the real shifts, one of the great things that feminism has achieved in a Jewish context, right, is not only that now we have women who are rabbis and scholars and religious leaders, even even in the Orthodox world, right? But also that because of that move towards openness, right? We now have an opportunity to introduce much more sophisticated understandings of gender and human sexuality into, and again, even into Orthodox communities. All right. So I loved Barbara Baird's point, right? That the mother, right, is the one who says this horrible thing, right? Yet Oliver Sacks, right, who's also a doctor, right, is not necessarily comfortable in saying that, oh, it's because because they thought that I was a sick person, right, and that made me really upset. It's he goes to the religious, right, which I just think is a very interesting, just an interesting point to notice, right, is that he was deeply engaged in medicine, right? So he's not going to attack his mother for considering him insane, right, or mentally ill because of the medical ideology of the day in which he swam, right? Maybe didn't even notice it, but because he remembers her expressing it, right, in religious language, right, that makes a final break for him with religion, right? And I think that, in part because he's only loosely connected at this point to Judaism, right? So it doesn't feel like much of a loss to him. So he can put his anger and he can assign, right, bigotry and cruelty. He can assign that to religion, right? And that doesn't have to be assigned, at least in this essay, to quote unquote science. So just want to point that out because I think it's very easy for us, right, to get into the kind of either or thinking that Oliver Sacks here seems to be falling into, right? And assigning all of the bad stuff to one side of it, right? Some of us assign all the bad stuff to science, right? Some of us assign all the bad stuff to religion, right? And the rest of us are saying, well, there's problems everywhere here. What are we going to do? How are we going to make our way through this? All right. So, and meaning, right? So very interesting, right? That he rejects his Judaism, right, on the basis of its capacity for bigotry or cruelty, right? But that leads, right, to this crisis. He has no meaning, right? His belonging, right, is with the weightlifters.
Turn down the sound, it's way too high, way too high.
Renee, are you okay?
Yeah, just as I'm trying to tone down the volume.
On my volume.
Yeah,
Okay. Is anyone else having that problem? I'm talking too loud? No. Okay, Renee, what you might do is turn down the volume on your device.
that's okay. I don't want to interrupt the meeting.
Okay, great. All right, so what you see, right, is that he has a sort of community with weightlifters and with his neurology residents, right? But he didn't have the sort of depth of connection, right, and meaning that web of family and religious culture had offered him, right? And so we see one of the very important aspects of religion, right, is it's not so much you believe or you don't believe or you practice or you don't practice, right? It's that you belong, right? That you have a connection to the people around you, right? And when that is lacking, right, that can lead to this sort of lack of meaning, which can be very, very difficult. Which is not to say that religion is the only place you can get that, right? You can get it through sports, you can get it through work, right? But religious institutions tend to be a place that are explicitly about that, right? But as he found, right, very often the terms of membership, right, are a level of conformity that make it difficult to be there. It's one of the reasons why it can be so hard for Jews to actually decide upon a shul. They're shul shopping, right, because they can't find a place where they really feel comfortable. All right, so let's continue. Recovery started slowly as I found meaningful work in New York in a chronic care hospital in the Bronx. It's the Mount Carmel I wrote about in Awakenings. I was fascinated by my patients there, cared for them deeply, and felt something of a mission to tell their stories of situations virtually unknown, almost unimaginable to the general public and indeed to many of my colleagues. I had discovered my vocation, and this I pursued doggedly, single-mindedly, with little encouragement from my colleagues. Almost unconsciously, I became a storyteller at a time when medical narrative was almost extinct. Right. So again, this is a very interesting for me piece, right? Because it is part of the kind of scientific movement in the modern period, right, away from narrative and towards data, right, which we're still kind of living in a little bit now, right? But it's another way in which you can sort of see this. The limitations of science, or at least of scientific ways of looking at the world. I mean, it's great to be data driven. Don't get me wrong, but it's also not enough, I think. Right? This did not dissuade me, for I felt my roots lay in the great neurological case histories of the 19th century. And I was encouraged here by the great Russian neuropsychologist A.R. Luria. He actually had a correspondence with him. It was a lonely but deeply satisfying, almost monkish existence that I was to lead for many years. During the 1990s, I came to know a cousin and contemporary of mine, Robert Jane Allman, a man of remarkable appearance with his robust athletic build, and long white beard that made him, even at 60, look like an ancient sage. He is a man of great intellectual power, but also of great human warmth and tenderness, and deep religious commitment. Commitment, in quotation marks, indeed is one of his favorite words. Although in his work he stands for rationality in economics and human affairs, there is no conflict for him between reason and faith. Right? For many great scientists, right, there is no such conflict. Right? They are two necessary components of their being. He insisted I have a mezuzah on my door and brought me one from Israel. I know you don't believe, he said, but you should have one anyhow. I didn't argue. In a remarkable 2004 interview, Robert John spoke of his lifelong work in mathematics and game theory, but also of his family, how he would go skiing and mountaineering with some of his nearly 30 children. Oh my God. Oh, and grandchildren. A kosher cook carrying saucepans would accompany them, and the importance of the Sabbath to him. The observance of the Sabbath is extremely beautiful, he said, and it is impossible without being religious. It is not even a question of improving society. It is about improving one's own quality of life. It's not about, it's not about making the world a better place, right? Although maybe it does do that, right? It's really about making your life the most high quality it can be. In December of 2005, Robert John received a Nobel Prize for his 50 years of fundamental work in economics. He was not entirely an easy guest for the Nobel Committee, for he went to Stockholm with his family, including many of those children and grandchildren, and all had to have special kosher plates, utensils, and food, and special formal clothes with no biblically forbidden admixture. of wool and linen. That same month, I was found to have cancer in one eye. And while I was in the hospital for treatment that following month, Robert John visited. He was full of entertaining stories about the Nobel Prize and the ceremony in Stockholm, but made a point of saying that had he been compelled to travel to Stockholm on a Saturday, he would have refused the prize. His commitment to the Sabbath, its utter peacefulness and remoteness from worldly concerns, would have trumped even a Nobel. In 1955, as a 22-year-old, I went to Israel for several months to work on a kibbutz. And though I enjoyed it, I decided not to go again. Even though so many of my cousins had moved there, the politics of the Middle East stirred me, and I suspected I would be out of place in a deeply religious society. But in the spring of 2014, hearing that my cousin Marjorie, a physician who had been a protege of my mother's and had worked in the field of medicine till the age of 98, it's amazing, was nearing death, I phoned her in Jerusalem to say farewell. Her voice was unexpectedly strong and resonant, with an accent very much like my mother's. "I don't intend to die now," she said. "I will be having my 100th birthday on June 18th. Will you come?" I said, "Yes, of course." When I hung up, I realized that in a few seconds I had reversed a decision of almost 60 years. It was purely a family visit. I celebrated Marjorie's 100th with her and extended family. I saw two other cousins dear to me in my London days, innumerable second and removed cousins, and of course Robert John. I felt embraced by my family in a way I had not known since childhood. Really powerful, right? That it brings back for him this embrace of the Sabbath community. I had felt a little fearful visiting my Orthodox family with my lover, Billy. My mother's words still echoed in my mind. But Billy, too, was warmly received. How profoundly attitudes had changed, even among the Orthodox, was made clear by Robert John when he invited Billy and me to join him and his family at their opening Sabbath meal. The peace of the Sabbath, of a stopped world, a time outside time, was palpable, infused everything, and I found myself drenched with a wistfulness, something akin to nostalgia, wondering, what if A and B and C had been different? What sort of person might I have been? What sort of life might I have lived? In December 2014, I completed my memoir, On the Move, and gave the manuscript to my publisher, not dreaming that days later I would learn I had metastatic cancer, coming from the melanoma I had in my eye 9 years earlier. I am glad I was able to complete my memoir without knowing this, and that I had been able, for the first time in my life, to make a full and frank declaration of my sexuality, facing the world openly, with no more guilty secrets locked up inside me. In February, I felt I had to be equally open about my cancer and facing death. I was, in fact, in the hospital when my essay on this, my own life, was published in this newspaper. In July, I wrote another piece for the paper, My Periodic Table, in which the physical cosmos and the elements I love took on lives of their own. And now, weak, short of breath, my once firm muscles melted away by cancer, I find my thoughts increasingly not on the supernatural or spiritual, but on what is meant by living a good and worthwhile life, achieving a sense of peace within oneself. I find my thoughts drifting to the Sabbath, the day of rest, the seventh day of the week, and perhaps the seventh day of one's life as well, when one can feel that one's work is done, and one may, in good conscience, rest. So I, as you can see, I've stopped the share. Hello, Renee, and let's see, in 8419, is that Norman? I don't know. All right, so I open the floor. Please feel free to unmute if you'd like to if you have something that is burning your tongue and you want to say it. Otherwise, I'll just go around and call on people and ask for their reflections. All right, so why don't we start with Ellen? Oh, go ahead, Barbara. Go ahead, Barbara.
I just wanted to say that I found this whole thing very moving when I read it. Somehow, I don't know quite why, but I did.
Yeah.
I liked it.
Yeah, I really loved this. I really love this essay. I think for me, part of it is that he comes back to the Sabbath at the end of his life, and he sort of is able to reconnect with what is good about the Sabbath, and he's able to realize that, you know, within Jewish communities, right, there's a much greater openness to people that are like him than there was before, and that he didn't necessarily need to leave everything behind, and he could, you know, even if obviously he can't change his own history, right, but he can come back. He can come back to it, and to sort of conceive of his death as his own Sabbath, right, is really a profoundly spiritual way of thinking about death, even though he says it's not. Go ahead, Barbara Goldwasser.
Yeah, I found it interesting that he went to his father to tell him of it first.
Yeah.
You don't always anticipate that reaction, because usually a man might not know how to deal with it, and obviously he went to the mother. And I guess, you know, my wonder is whether he was nervous to tell his mother.
I mean, it sounds like
Or
it,
who
right?
was the strong person? Who's the stronger person in the family?
Right.
What are the dynamics?
Right. Obviously that we won't know from this memoir, but you know, it might be in his memoir on the move. I don't know. I've only read bits and pieces of that, but I think what's interesting, right, is that he presents that conversation as having been his father sort of forcing it out of him, right? It sounds like he didn't really want to tell either of them, and that he was hiding. And you know, you sort of get that trope at the end of the essay where he's written his memoir and he hasn't had to hide, right? He's able to face the world without any you know, shameful secrets. And it's hard to imagine, right, in 1950s, 1960s London. Yeah, go ahead, Jean.
He may have blamed religion, but it affected his relationship with his mother for his entire life.
Yeah.
It really spoiled that relationship. And it also crippled his ability to form relationships with other people.
Yeah.
And last night I watched the film Awakenings.
Oh, right.
Based on his book.
Yeah.
And anyone who hasn't seen it should really watch it. It's amazing. It's on Amazon. And it's when he just goes to the hospital for chronic disease in New York. And it's very clear that he doesn't have friends, that he doesn't connect with the other doctors. Even with the nurse who kind of reaches out to him, he has difficulty establishing that relationship. Yeah. And it was really with his patients that he was first able to form any kind of really meaningful relationship. So I think, you know, he may have blamed religion, but his mother's condemnation really affected his entire life.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Barbara.
It also may have been his personality. He may have had a problem dealing directly on issues that were really close to him. Yeah. So it may not have been just his mother, right, or just a person. It may have been how he deals with people.
Yeah, and he
could do it on paper. He
right,
can do it in a surrounding that's comfortable to him. Perhaps.
Yeah, he does mention in another essay what a shy person he was. Yeah, go ahead, Jean.
And part of that shyness was a result of the really terrible experience he had had when he was sent away from London during the
Exactly.
Blitz
Right.
and went to a school where he was really badly treated. And when he came back, he had lost a lot of his ability to connect with other people.
Right, right. And for a person like that, right, when you don't have friends and then you feel rejected by your family, you really feel like you have nobody, right? And that is, it's just wrenching. And yeah, go ahead, Naomi.
Of course, one thing he does not mention is he had an awful lot of siblings,
Right.
and he makes no mention of how or whether. And you would think that out of 17 or 16 other people, admittedly with a probably very broad age range, that somewhere in that family, there could have been something that.
Right. There could have been someone who served as a kind of a what do they call it?
Liaison is
Yeah. Or just
Yeah.
just some sort of a
Or even just sympathetic holder on to.
exactly.
And he doesn't mention the siblings at all, except, well, again, I haven't read his memoir.
Except
Yeah,
one in this memoir, in this article, just the one that went to Australia, right? So presumably never seen
Yeah.
again. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now go ahead, Gene. And then Sandy. After Gene is done, you can go, Sandy.
Actually, I think he was only one of 4 siblings. It was his mother who had all the siblings.
Yes.
So he had
Right,
many,
you're
Oh,
right.
sorry about, sorry.
many uncles and aunts. And this is his Uncle Tungsten is his memoir of his childhood. And Uncle Tungsten is his mother's brother who had a lamp company and was a scientist. And he had a very close relationship with that uncle and with several of his other uncles. So there were adults in his life that he really admired and who really cared for him.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's
Okay.
good.
Yeah, I
Thank you,
haven't-
Gene, for that. I'm so happy you're here to give us this background information that I just don't have at my fingertips. Go ahead, Sandy.
She's muted.
Sandy, unmute.
There we go. It's
Oh,
working. There we go. There we go.
Okay. At the hospital in the Bronx, in my neighborhood, it was very comfortably called I'm blanking on the name, and the people were all suffering from what they called the sleeping sickness.
Yeah.
So they were all ill. And that's where he spent most of his life,
Right.
working with people.
And it's interesting, Sandy, that you mentioned that, because I remember from Awakenings that many of those people that had that sleeping sickness were people that had suffered from the flu pandemic in the late teens of the last century, and so many of them had been, ill there for like 40 years. I mean, they were not young people, and it's really a fascinating. The Awakening is a fascinating book.
My grandmother, my maternal, that was the neighborhood in which I grew up until I got married. My maternal grandmother was a wonderful woman. And her youngest daughter was assigned the job on Fridays of going and bringing fruit to the people who lived at that hospital. My aunt didn't really like that job. And my grandmother said, "You get to get out of there." They don't.
That's right. That's right. Renee, would you like to add your thoughts?
She's muted.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
No, I just just found it very moving, but I was very much reminded by that movie Awakenings. It's a very powerful film.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, forgotten about it.
Great. Phyllis, would you like to add your thoughts?
Okay. I I looked upon that kind of essay, we'll call it, as kind of a surprise to me, because I was not brought up religious. Okay, everything I know about religion, I really had to find out on my own, and I always viewed the practice of the Sabbath as a way, a special way of setting a time apart from the world. And I actually admired people who believed it. And he doesn't seem to talk about that aspect of it, which surprised me.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I made that analogy, right? That you're not aware of the water. A fish isn't aware of the water that they're swimming in, right? Right. So I think in a way, right, if you grow up in Shabbos, right, you can identify the things that you do and you don't do, right, on Shabbos. But it might take until you're an adult, right, and you go, like he went to Robert John's house. And in that context, right, he's able to experience the Sabbath as a time out of time, right? And he's able to grasp some of the beauty and the power of the practice because he's able to see it a little bit as an outsider. Whereas, someone who's, I mean, this is always, I think, the interesting, there's actually a new book that's called Dangerous Religious Ideas. It sort of posits the notion, right, that every religion is based in part on dangerous religious ideas, right, and that every religion has, at least the author, who's Rachel Mikvah, her name, talks about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that there's a long tradition in all three of these faiths, right, of critical inquiry, right, of looking at our ideas and looking at our practices, right, and identifying, what are the most dangerous places and how do we walk that thin line? And I think that, with the Sabbath, right, if you just grow up with it and you have no idea no one ever tells you what it's for, it's just, this is just what we do, right?
Yeah.
Then it's hard to get. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one way of maybe understanding it. But thank you for pointing that out, because that I hadn't, as someone who came to Sabbath observance from the outside, I never had anything in Judaism is just a matter of course. Right? It's all at some level, intentional. Which is with that, and that's the issue of belonging, right? Is that because that is true in some way. That level of belonging that he felt as a kid, right, was just so lost. And
right.
And the hinge, right, is this terrible, terrible statement from his mother. I mean, alienating and really debilitating, as Jean points out. Barbara, just wait one moment. I want to see if is 8419. Is that Norman? If you push *6, you'll be able to talk. Okay, so I'm assuming you're not there. Okay, so go ahead, Barbara. Gold Wasser, I mean.
No, I was just saying it's muted. That's all I said.
Oh, okay.
No.
Ellen, Saro, would you like to add anything? You're muted, though.
When I had any experience of Shabbat, it was a punishment. It was just dreadful. And I had my father's father thought he was religious. He wasn't. He was cruel. And he was cruel to everybody who was female, particularly.
Oy.
And the thing is, I certainly grew up with other people who were Jewish, and we didn't compare Shabbats, but I knew they had what our author calls the being part of it.
Yeah.
And it was very interesting. And then my brother, my blood brother, married the daughter of a rabbi, and they loved Shabbat, and they would come to my mother's apartment, and of course I had to do the shopping for the food and all that because my mother could, and they wouldn't because it was Shabbat. But I also read Heschel's The Sabbath,
Yes.
and that had a huge impact on me.
Yeah.
And I treasure it.
Yeah.
I give it as a to kids turning into bat or bar mitzvahs. That's a standard gift I give. And the other thing about writing about experience, not data, in science and in medicine. For 5 years, I was a manuscript editor at New England Journal for Medicine, which was the hardest work I've ever done in my life.
Yeah.
And it was fascinating because they had a new editor-in-chief, who was interested in data and getting people to write about new medicines and stuff, which that was all there was. It wasn't as if real people were involved. But there had been, under the previous editor, a strong, and the previous to the previous one too, had a very real, almost ethical commitment to keeping science in relation to human beings living or dying.
Yeah.
And I read, when people told me about that, I used to get the copies of the older stuff to read. And it was especially interesting on the subject of dying.
Yes.
And I really, really feel that had a very important thing for me. Unfortunately, I got ill and I couldn't work anymore.
Oh, yeah.
Well, it was also freedom.
Yeah.
In a funny way.
Exactly. Yeah, go ahead, Naomi. And you get the last word.
I'm familiar with that kind of neighborhood. I had Orthodox cousins whom we visited frequently who lived in one of those inclusive neighborhoods. And indeed, parts of that neighborhood, as the neighborhood started so-called changing, unquote, picked itself up and moved to another section of Brooklyn.
Yeah.
But none of the children that I know of, and the same thing has happened with Sachs's family, everybody who was younger voluntarily left.
Right.
And whether it would have been economically or socially practical to have stayed, I don't know. All I know is that a lot of them left. The closest that any one of them has come to Orthodoxy is the one who moved to Jerusalem.
Oh, okay.
She's not so terribly Orthodox.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's fascinating the way that especially Jewish communities, because they rely on proximity, and they are intentionally multi-generational communities. If the younger people move out, it's really difficult for them to maintain. I mean, we have this, as Ellen Soro knows, we have this in the Worship and Study Minion at Harvard, where we have primarily, people older than me. And I'm not a particularly old guy, but if I'm one of the younger members of the congregation, it's not looking good.
Yeah.
So anyway, well, thank you all very much. I very much appreciate. Yeah, go ahead, Barbara. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To be continued.